What if everything that you have been told about these ancient structures were only part of the story? Today we'll examine both the mainstream interpretation and the alternative view, because iron sharpens iron, and truth has nothing to fear from investigation. Were these monuments simply the achievements of ancient civilizations, or do they point to something far more mysterious, something connected to Genesis 6, the Nephilim, and ancient traditions of giants? Let's find out.
Never been to Sacsayhuamán. I've never been invited. But if I did go down there, I wouldn't even know how to distinguish what the scholarly crew thinks about it and what maybe the more fringe theorists think about it.
In regard to the megaliths in Peru, there's many megalithic sites in Peru. The academic consensus is that most of these sites, especially the ones around Cusco, also Ollantaytambo, Machu Picchu, were constructed by the Inca. And the Inca were an extraordinary empire. I mean, this was an extraordinary civilization. They were able to do many things that other pre-Columbian cultures could not achieve. In many ways, they were like the Romans of South America. They built amazing roads and aqueducts. And so I have a lot of respect for the Inca civilization, but they did not build the megaliths.
It's because the Inca, while old, aren't that old.
No, they're not that old. So I believe that the Inca discovered these megalithic sites, Machu Picchu, certainly Sacsayhuamán, and they decided to inhabit them and rebuild them because the Inca viewed themselves as the offspring of the gods. They were the children of the sun. And when you talk about the Inca does not describe the totality of the culture, of the civilization. The Inca was a very specific, very particular bloodline within that civilization. It was the royal bloodline. Only they were the Inca. The Spanish called them the orejones because they had the large discs in their ears. They had the large earlobes.
Like my barista at Starbucks, yeah.
Yes,
right.
Yes. And so this culture, within this culture, the Inca culture, you have this royal bloodline, as I said, who considered themselves to be the offspring of the gods. And so when they came upon the megalithic ruins, the remains of what they could only interpret as the works of the gods. I mean, we're talking about massive stones that are, as I said, cut with such precision that they're fitted together without the use of mortar. And archaeologists refer to this style of building, this style of masonry, as Cyclopean masonry. And you find it all over the earth, especially as it pertains to megaliths, because obviously Peru isn't the only place on the planet with megaliths. But this architecture, Cyclopean architecture, where they have these massive stones exquisitely cut and dressed and then fit together without the use of mortar, I believe that is the signature of an ancient advanced civilization that was annihilated from the face of the earth in the deep past.
What time are we talking about? How deep is it?
We're talking 10,000 plus years ago.
Okay. So the scholarly consensus view is that human civilization arose within the last, 5,000 years?
Yeah.
And you're saying, no, there was this to our understanding, human civilization that built all this stuff. So then the question, of course, is who were they and where did they go? And why do you think this? I mean, why couldn't the Inca have done it?
Well, let me address that first. We know that the Inca didn't build the walls of Sacsayhuamán. Now, you won't read this in any history books, and you won't hear archaeologists saying this. But my friend and colleague Anselm P. Rambla, he's a Spanish explorer and researcher, and he actually excavated at the walls of Sacsayhuamán, the walls I was referring to earlier, those magnificent megalithic walls. He got permission from the Ministry of Culture in Peru to conduct an excavation in the site, generally in various areas of Sacsayhuamán. And he dug down to the foundation stones of Sacsayhuamán, to the lower levels. Yeah. And what he discovered at the lower levels were pre-Incan artifacts, and only pre-Incan artifacts.
How do you know? What distinguishes a pre-Incan artifact?
Well, I mean, there's artifacts that archaeologists can identify as Inca, and then artifacts that belong to cultures that pre-existed the Inca or that were conquered by the Inca.
So the kind of artifact that you wouldn't have found at a higher level, I guess.
Precisely right. Okay. So he's digging deep down into the soil there in front of Sacsayhuamán, and he's finding only pre-Incan artifacts. This is a definitive evidence that those walls pre-exist the Inca. They were there before the Inca discovered them. In fact, we talked about Sacsayhuamán also being a megalithic site. Most people don't realize that Machu Picchu is also a megalithic site. And Machu Picchu is extraordinary. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world that I've ever seen. I mean, certainly in terms of archaeological remains, Machu Picchu is phenomenal. Most people don't realize that the foundations of Machu Picchu are megalithic, and they have the same sort of polygonal, cyclopean architecture as you see in Cusco. And the Inca, I believe, discovered these ruins, and seeing themselves as the offspring of the gods, they concluded that it was their birthright to inhabit what was once the habitation of the gods and rebuild their monuments. And everywhere you go in Peru, and I would say all around the world, people have made use, obviously, of these magnificent megalithic foundations and have built with inferior techniques on top of them. And this is evident in Machu Picchu. This is certainly evident in Machu Picchu. In fact, Machu Picchu, the Quechua, the real name for Machu Picchu is Ijampu. And what does Ijampu mean? The abode of the gods, the dwelling of the gods.
So if this is so evident in Machu Picchu, why don't any of the people at Harvard agree that this is a megalithic pre-modern notions of ancient history structure?
Because they're worried about their careers. They're worried about the esteem of their colleagues. They're worried about being published in the prestigious magazines and having a future in their field. And they would be ostracized. I mean, if you talk about, let's put it this way. When I was at I've been to Machu Picchu numerous occasions. And there was this particular time, I was actually with my colleague Anselm Piramla at the time, and there was a guide, and he was very, very, very knowledgeable. He was an old guide. He's been a guide there for decades, and the guides are very well trained in the conventional narrative of the Inca and especially of Machu Picchu.
Yeah.
And we were quizzing him on certain aspects of the architecture at Machu Picchu. For example, you can look across the courtyard at Machu Picchu and you'll see a wall, a megalithic wall with polygonal stones, which means they're stones that have all different kinds of angles in them. Some of these stones have a dozen angles in them, and they're fit precisely to the other stones around them. And they're anti-seismic, by the way. But then right on top of them, you would have this inferior stonework. And some of that, much of that is archaeological reconstruction, but some of it we know was the Inca did it. They built on top. And I asked him, I said, that wall there, very clearly, the lower levels are superior to the higher levels. You were looking at two different techniques of masonry, of architecture, one superior, one inferior. How do you explain that if the Inca built that? Why would they start off with this superior technique and then gradually the technique becomes inferior? Why would they do that? What's the explanation? What is the conventional explanation? And he thought about it for a moment and he said, because that's the way they like to do it. That was the answer. Because that's the way
because they did
to do it. Exactly.
Because they did.
And I said, well, how is that rational? How can you logically deduce this? Yeah. I mean, honestly, that they did this just because that's the way they like to do it, or they like the way it looked. I said, you're a smart guy. You're well trained in academia, and they are, all of the guides up there at Machu Picchu. I said, there's no way you actually believe that. Yeah. And he conceded to us, yeah, you're right. That's ludicrous. Huh. It really is ludicrous. And so what are we looking at? The megaliths around the world, not just in Peru. We're talking about the ones in Peru here, but they're all over the world. Baalbek, for example, is one of the most magnificent. I mean, you have
Baalbek.
Baalbek is a megalithic site in Lebanon. It's one of the most magnificent megalithic sites on Earth. Huge stones that weigh thousands of tons. And of course, the conventional explanation is that the Romans built it, and indeed they raised a temple to Jupiter there on that site. But just like the Inca discovered the megaliths and determined that they were going to build on top of them and rebuild the abode of the gods, so I believe the Romans and cultures that predate the Romans did the same thing. Of course you're going to use the megalithic foundations. See, the megaliths, it's not just exquisite architecture, it's not just exquisite masonry. They're anti-seismic.
Okay.
They're built in such a way that they don't collapse during earthquakes. Right. And I'll go back to Cusco here, because Cusco is a perfect example of this. When the Spaniards invaded and conquered the city of Cusco, they began to disassemble the higher levels of Sacsayhuamán, because it starts off with large foundational stones, and the stones gradually get smaller as they ascend to the top of the structure. And so they took all of the stones that they could manage and carry away, and they built their cathedrals. And the Spanish were no slouches at building cathedrals, okay? The Spaniards had amazing architects, and they knew what they were doing. And they built their cathedrals in the city of Cusco on top of the ruins of the Incan temples that they demolished. And they built their cathedrals, and every time there's a major earthquake, the cathedrals fall. But you know what doesn't fall? Those megalithic walls that I believe have been standing there for thousands of years.
Is one explanation as to why the craftsmanship gets shoddier toward the top just that it's harder to build stuff the higher up you go? Is that, I don't know. What do I know? I don't know anything about architecture.
No, if you look at if you look at some of these walls, you'll notice that there's this exquisite architecture. There's this impressive superior masonry, and then you'll find gaps in that masonry where obviously something happened and they had to replace the original stone, and they replaced it with a totally different inferior technique and inferior stonework. And it's evident. For example, we'll go back to Peru for a minute. You go to this megalithic site called Ollantaytambo. Ollantaytambo is a fascinating site because in Peru you're going to find two different techniques for megalith building. One of the techniques is the polygonal, what's known as the beveled polygonal, cyclopean walls. But then you're going to find, and this other technique you find in Bolivia as well, it's the interlocking, the interlocking blocks. In this method, they would actually, it was like Legos, they would actually cut out let's say a rectangular shape inside of the block, and then they would fit it on top of a rectangular shape protruding from the block below it. It would interlock like a Lego. And in Ollantaytambo, you find both of these techniques together. You find the polygonal and the interlocking. And what's unique about Ollantaytambo is that this megalithic complex was in the process of being built. You can see it. The stones are being dressed, and they're making their way up the side of the mountain where the complex crescendos in this temple structure called the Temple of the Sun at the top, very large stones in excess of probably somewhere around 80 to 100 tons. And you can see the blocks making their way up, and they're being dressed, and they're huge megalithic blocks. And there's even one particular block where it appears as if somebody was cutting into it with like a circular saw. I mean, you can see the cut mark right through the block. And it just stopped. It halted. The construction came to an abrupt halt. And now the conventional explanation is that the halt was because the Spaniards had arrived, and the Inca were in the process of building another temple. The Spaniards arrived, so they stopped the work, and they had to combat the Spanish. In fact, they fought the only battle the Inca really won against the Spaniards was one right there at Sacsayhuamán, because they were able to flood the valley. It's an amazing story. It really is an incredible story. But they didn't build those walls. I'm absolutely persuaded that the Inca did not build those walls. And furthermore, many of these megaliths around the world, including at Ollantaytambo, are specifically aligned to particular cosmological phenomena. And you can date the monument with the stars.
Right.
This is called archaeoastronomy. And I have a good friend in Cusco, his name is Andres Adasme. He's an archaeoastronomer. And he figured out at Ollantaytambo that the dating was based on a solar alignment, and it's very complex. But he dates it to around 10,000 BC. Well, he also did the same thing with the city of Cusco, and that's based on some particular solar phenomenon revolving around the three most important celestial objects for the Andean community, which is the Milky Way, the winter solstice, and the Southern Cross. Those are the three primary celestial markers for the Andean people. And based on those markers, you can reverse the clock with programs such as Stellarium, and you can see if there are any celestial events, if the precession of the equinox and all kinds of different things, if there's a lock, if it can lock in other words, if you can find a pattern.
Right.
And he did in the city of Cusco, and the date was 10,000 BC. And I'm using Peru as an example to illustrate a larger point here. It's the same all over the world as it pertains to megalith.
Have you ever wondered why the Inca claimed that their rulers were descendants from gods? And what it has to do with massive megalithic stone structures found throughout Peru? As Tim said, the Inca civilization was centered in what is now Peru, with its capital at Cusco. Unlike the Greeks who believed in large pantheons of gods like Zeus and Athena, the Inca believed that their emperor, the Sapa Inca, was a direct descendant of the sun god, Inti. In that sense, the royal bloodline itself was considered divine. This raises an interesting question. Why did the Inca associate themselves so closely with the gods? And one reason may be the ancient sites that they inherited. Throughout the Andes are enormous megalithic structures made from massive stones fitted together with astonishing precision, just as Tim said. Places like this, I'm not going to try to pronounce, as well as this, and here, a third. These places continue to fascinate archaeologists and historians. And here's where things get interesting. Mainstream scholars generally believe that these sites show a long history of civilization in the Andes. When archaeologists find older remains beneath certain structures, they interpret that as evidence that different cultures occupied, rebuilt, and expanded the same secondary locations over centuries. In this view, the Inca inherited the legacy of earlier civilizations and built upon it. But researcher Tim Alberino sees the evidence differently. Alberino argues that some of the largest megalithic structures may have already existed before the Inca arrived. He suggests that the Inca themselves, they inherited these ancient sites and may have viewed them as the work of beings they considered godlike. In his interpretation, the pre-Inca remains found at these locations point to a much older civilization that predates the Inca by thousands of years. For Alberino, the Inca claims of divine ancestry may preserve echoes of ancient memory, one connected to mysterious builders and traditions that were already ancient when the Inca rose to power. Now, this discussion becomes even more interesting when viewed through the lens of Genesis 6. Alberino believes that Genesis 6 is an account of the sons of God, and the Nephilim describes a real supernatural event in human history. He argues that this rebellion had profound effects on the ancient world and may help explain why so many cultures preserve traditions about gods descending from heaven and interacting with humans. But not all Christians agree. Teachers such as R.C. Sproul argue that the sons of God were not fallen angels, but rather the godly lineage of Seth intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain. In this framework, the corruption of humanity came through spiritual compromise and the mixing of the covenant people of God with those who rejected him. However, supporters of the angelic view point out that the Hebrew phrase, B'nai Ha-Elohim, sons of God, I probably did not pronounce that right, is issued elsewhere in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Job, where it refers to heavenly beings. They argue that if Scripture interprets Scripture, the most natural reading of Genesis 6 is that these were supernatural beings rather than merely human descendants of Seth. And we also must note that the Bible contains examples of angels appearing in human form and interacting physically with the world. Abraham encountered angels who appeared as men, and the book of Hebrews tells believers that some have entertained angels without even knowing it. For supporters of the angelic view, these passages demonstrate that supernatural beings can manifest in ways that interact with the physical world. And for these reasons, Alberino and others believe that the angelic interpretation, it deserves serious consideration, and it may provide a framework for understanding some of the mysterious traditions found throughout the ancient world. So which interpretation is correct? Mainstream archaeology sees a succession of human civilizations building upon another. Mainstream proponents of the Sethite view within the Christian framework see Genesis 6 as describing the corruption of humanity through ungodly intermarriage. Alberino, on the other hand, he sees evidence of a forgotten civilization whose legacy survived in the myths and the traditions of later cultures. He also sees Genesis 6 as recording a supernatural rebellion that left a lasting mark on human history. So whether you agree with Sproul's interpretation or Alberino's, Genesis 6 remains one of the most debated passages in Scripture. So the question ultimately becomes this: was Genesis 6 describing the corruption of humanity through an ungodly intermarrying through Seth's lineage, or was it recording a supernatural rebellion that shaped the ancient world? And depending on how you answer this question, the stories of ancient civilizations, giant traditions, and even the origins of megalithic sites may look very different. Either way, these incredible stone monuments continue to raise questions that scholars, researchers, theologians, and explorers are still debating today. And it's interesting to consider all frameworks. Tim said a lot of the mainstream scholars are not going to talk about what this may be pointing to because they love their career. Scholars know that if they say this seems to infer giants, they're going to lose their job because it points to biblical evidence and confirms it. Thanks for watching.